Do you feel lost, like you've wandered into a dense, shadowed wood, unsure of the path forward? Do distractions pull you from the still, small voice, leaving your soul restless and searching? Have you felt the weight of silence and wondered if God has left you alone? Here on the Distracted Christian Podcast, we walk that dark night together. Every step draws us closer to the one who's been waiting. His love is the light that guides, His grace, the compass that never fails. The wind along the plains had grown strange. Dry stalks cracked beneath his boots, brittle as old bones, remnants of a harvest long devoured by drought and fire. The soil was loose with ash and salt, each step sending a faint puff spiraling into the air. The sky above stretched pale and thin, neither threatening nor promising. Sweat beaded along his brow beneath the open air. Ahead, a village slumped against the horizon. Charcoal flyers clung to doors and fence posts, their corners curled by sun and dust. The black charcoal, smudged and faded, declared, "The last mouthpiece brings the flame, tonight only." A few were nailed back over torn edges, as if someone had tried to reject them but couldn't quite let go. Passing villagers kept their eyes away. The square was nearly empty, the air heavy with what lingered after the spectacle. Near the well, a blind beggar woman wept, rocking in slow rhythm. "He gave me sight," she whispered to no one. "I saw the stars for a night, and now darkness." The final words cracked in her throat. The wanderer knelt beside her, saying nothing. Her hand groped outward and found his wrist, and her grip was surprisingly strong. "Why did he leave?" she asked. "Why would the light go again?" The words cut him. Here was the soul who had touched the fire, only to have it torn away, and he could not restore it. He tried to pray for her silently, but the prayer just died unspoken. Shame pressed against his ribs. "I'm sorry," he muttered, pressing a silver coin into her palm. Her fingers closed, but she kept rocking, and he arose. He crossed the square, his feet dragging along. The tavern ahead leaned to one side, its beams dark with old rain. A cluster of men stood in its shade, mugs in hand, their eyes following him. One straightened and squinted. "Wait, I know that face." Another stepped forward. "Isn't it Starborn?" he said, disbelief stretching across the name. A third spat. "Ash King's giving us miracles now. What have you done for us lately?" The others murmured the name Starborn, rolling between them without its old weight. Once it had opened gates and crowds landed in the dust like a pebble. You raised the dead. You called fire with a breath." "I cannot do that anymore," the wanderer said, his voice calm, his eyes steady. He lifted a hand, palm open. "The true flame gives without cost. It cannot be forced or traded." That only hardened their faces. Then a fist struck his side, sharp enough to fold his breath in half. A boot caught his leg, driving him to one knee, palm scraping against the stone. "Pray for the fire now, prophet," someone hissed. He did not. Even as the blows fell, his heart ached for them more. "Let this be my penance," he thought. "Let me bear it." When he didn't cry out or fight, the thrill drained from their eyes. The blows slowed, then stopped altogether. One muttered, "Not worth it." And they drifted back towards the tavern. Still kneeling, he pressed one hand to the stone, the other trembling. Pain bloomed slow, deep in his ribs. Each breath was a labor. A thought rose quiet and cruel. "You were never chosen. You only believe you were." He tried to banish it. He rose, spine stiff, each motion deliberate. The world tilted, edge blurred. The alley seemed to close in before him. Breath slowed. He leaned on the wall until the ache of his breath in his ribs spread raw and insistent. At the end of the lane stood an old inn, its half-rotted door ajar. Inside smelled of mildew and old smoke. The stairs groaned beneath his weight. Above, in a loft, he found a straw bed and a broken beam and silence. He lay staring at the rafters. A spider moved along the thread, untouched by the prophecies or bruises. His chest burned with every breath. He tried to pray. The words tangled in his mouth. No name came. Instead came blasphemies, doubt, whispers of despair. You failed him. You never knew him at all. He clenched his jaw, fingers digging into the straw. No, please, he whispered. No voice answered, no presence, no fire, only silence. Long and total, sinking into his marrow. It was as if the air itself had withdrawn. The ache in his ribs was nothing compared to the weight pressing into his spirit. And from somewhere deep came the question, why allow this? And there was no answer, only the sound of his own breath and the cold space where the fire had been. His arms curled inward. For the first time in years, he wept. The tears shook him, soaking the straw. He did not even hide his face. He did not ask for the pain to stop. He let it wash over him, a flood that stripped every comfort from him. When the weeping had passed, nothing remained but breath. Prayer had become a foreign tongue. His lungs still moved. In, out, in, out. Gray seeped through the gaps in the roof, painting the room with mourning. His body ached as if it had been emptied and left to dry. He tied his cloak with slow hands, lifted his staff, though it felt heavier than stone. He got up, went down, and at the threshold he looked east. No sign, no voice, only the inner urge to confront the loveless Ash King, as if commanded by a voice that he did not know, the voice that he longed to hear again. And so he stepped forward. Welcome, friends, to the Distracted Christian Podcast, a production of Fresh Ground Theology. I'm your host, Nate Labadorf. My heart is still carrying the dust, the bruises, and the silence of the story we just entered. After a story like that, everything gets quiet, and you may feel it too. This is the edge of the dark night. Today we step into Book 2 of the Dark Night of the Soul, and we're focusing on chapters 5 and 6, where St. John of the Cross shows the hidden work of God that he does in the believer. In chapter 5, the suffering is mostly inside. God feels silent, prayer feels heavy, doubt grows, the soul feels stripped of comfort. Yet, St. John says, this painful cleansing can be a hidden grace. And in chapter 6, the night reaches into the body too. Fatigue settles in. The mind gets foggy. Old prayers feel empty. New prayers do not form. The soul fears it has failed, even while it longs for God more than ever. St. John says God is still there, reshaping the heart to love more freely. So take a steady breath, open your spirit gently to these mysteries. The path is shadowed, but it is also deeply human and full of unseen mercy. You're not walking alone, even when the silence feels absolute. Together, we'll walk through these chapters 5 and 6 with honesty and hope. So let's begin. What John of the Cross is doing in chapters 5 and 6 is both daring and psychologically sharp. He's trying to explain a paradox. Why something that comes from God, something pure and loving and meant for union, would feel like darkness, pain, abandonment, even death. And that's the puzzle. And his answer is unsettlingly precise, because It is so consistent. The darkness is not proof that God is absent. In these chapters, it is the opposite. The darkness comes because God is too present for the soul in its current condition. That's pretty much chapter 5 in a sentence. John begins by defining this dark night very carefully. It is not mere sadness, it is not random suffering, it is an inflow of God into the soul. And this phrase matters. The dark night is not the first of all the something the soul does. It is something that happens to the soul when God begins purging it of ignorance, imperfections, and attachments. The soul does not engineer this. It often does not understand it, and God is teaching it secretly, says John. Though what contemplatives call infused contemplation or mystical theology. That sounds lofty and serene until John asks the obvious question. If this is divine wisdom, if this is God's loving action, why does it feel like night? Why grief? Why torment? And his answer is in two parts. First, divine wisdom is too high for the human soul as it is. God's light is not dim, but so bright that it blinds. John reaches for an old image like an owl staring into daylight or a human eye trying to look directly at the sun. The problem is not the light, the problem is the weakness of the eye. In the same way, the soul in its ordinary, unpurified condition cannot comfortably receive the direct light of God. So, what is objectively illumination is subjectively darkness. That is one of the key moves of these chapters. John flips the meaning of the darkness. The darkness is not always a lack of light. Sometimes it is too much light for an unprepared faculty. Second, the soul is impure, and that impurity makes the divine light painful. This is where chapter 5 becomes almost a clinical diagnosis, it's a clinical spiritual diagnosis. The soul is not just limited, it is disordered. So when pure light enters, it does not merely exceed the soul's understanding. It exposes the soul itself. It reveals stains the soul has not fully seen. It forces a confrontation. Think of a room at dusk. It looks clean enough, but then the morning sunlight pours through the window, and suddenly dust is everywhere. The sunlight did not create the dust, it revealed it. And that's John's point. The soul feels miserable because God has turned on the light. He's not turned hostile, but God's presence shows the soul what is actually going on inside. And that revelation is agonizing. St. John says the soul begins to feel itself unworthy of God, unworthy even of any creature. It feels rejected. It thinks its good is over. It believes God is against it. And this is important. He does not say the soul merely notices its faults in a calm, detached way. He says it suffers from them. It experiences its own impurity as a wound. And then he adds another layer. The soul is weak, naturally, morally, spiritually. So the pressure of contemplation feels crushing. The soul nearly faints underneath it. God's touch, which is gentle in itself, feels heavy because the soul is so frail. This is one of John's most compassionate observations. He insists that God is not suddenly cruel. The same hand that is light and merciful feels unbearable only because the soul is sick and unsteady. The pain reveals the soul's condition, not God's malice. Chapter 6 pushes this argument further. If chapter 5 explained why the divine light feels dark and painful, chapter 6 describes what the pain actually feels like inside. Here, John's imagery becomes extreme: death, hell, burial, being swallowed alive. Why? Because John wants language strong enough for an experience that to him is not a mild spiritual inconvenience. The soul feels itself undone at the roots. He says two extremes meet here: the divine and the human. Divine contemplation comes not to decorate the old self, but to renew it, strip it to make it divine. That means the old man, the old habitual self with all its attachments, must be dismantled. The soul experiences that dismantling as a kind of spiritual death. This is why Jonah and the whale comes up. The soul feels enclosed, devoured, buried in darkness, waiting for a resurrection it cannot see. It feels abandoned by God, cast away, forgotten. The worst part of the suffering is often not the pain itself. It is the interpretation of the pain. It is the belief that pain means one has been discarded. And John understands that. The soul, he says, thinks this condition will last forever, that is part of this torment. He goes even further. Not only does the soul feel abandoned by God, it feels abandoned by creatures too. Friends seem far off. The world feels empty of comfort. And this is the collapse of the old support system. The things that once stabilized the soul no longer work. That includes temporal good, natural good, the spiritual good. John is very systematic here. The soul is emptied on all levels. The sense they're dry. The faculties cannot grasp anything satisfying. The spirit is left in darkness. This emptiness is not incidental. It is the method of purification. John's controlling metaphor in the second half of chapter 6 is fire and metal. God, contemplation of God is like a furnace. The soul is like metal covered in rust. Fire does not politely remove the rust at a distance. It penetrates, heats, melts, and transforms. And because the rust has become bound up with the metal, the process feels as if the metal itself is being destroyed. And that's exactly how St. John describes it. The affections, the habits, uh, all the imperfections have become so deep in the soul that to burn them away feels like annihilation. And yet, crucially, annihilation is not the goal. Renewal is. Humbling is not the end. Exaltation is. John says God humbles the soul greatly so that he may later exalt it greatly. That line is essential because otherwise these two chapters would collapse into pure despair. They are severe, not nihilistic. The night is purgative, it purges. Death is preparatory. Burial is aimed at resurrection. So the core claim of chapters 5 and 6 is this: when God draws near to the soul to transform it, the soul first experiences that nearness as darkness, exposure, weakness, emptiness, and even death. Not because God is absent, but because God is burning away everything in the soul that cannot live in the union with Him. And this is the difficult brilliance of these chapters. John refuses sentimental religion. He does not say divine love always feels warm and affirming and intelligible. Sometimes, he says, love arrives as a crisis. Sometimes healing feels like being broken open. Sometimes light appears first as blindness. And for John, that's not contradiction. It is the logic of transformation. After reading through chapters 5 and 6, we can turn to the Bible, and particularly Lamentations chapter 3, which starts to look less like a random cry of pain and more like a map of purgation. And I think that is one way you can look at it. God's dark work feels like a contradiction, according to St. John. The soul experiences divine light as darkness, divine nearness as abandonment, divine cleansing as torment. And this is exactly the emotional logic of Lamentations chapter 3. Judah is not merely suffering political collapse. This poem presents a people under the severe hand of God, stripping of false strength, false security, a false self-understanding. And that is what John says happens in the dark night of the soul. Judah, let's start there. In Lamentations chapter 3, the Spirit says, in effect, God has driven me into darkness. He feels hedged in, worn down, broken, buried. That sounds extreme until you remember that what Judah had been clinging to: covenant privilege without covenant faithfulness, temple confidence without obedience, national identity without holiness. The collapse of Jerusalem is therefore not just a punishment in the narrow sense. It is also this exposure. God is uncovering what Judah really is. The nation had imagined itself secure. Under judgment, it discovers its own poverty. This is pretty much pure chapter 5 of St. John's Dark Night of the Soul. John says the divine light is painful because it reveals impurity. The soul thinks God has become an enemy, when in fact God is making it see what was hidden. Lamentations 3 works the same way. Judah is forced to see its rebellion, its emptiness, and helplessness. And that pain was not meaningless, it is revelatory. God is tearing away all illusions. Then chapter 6 gives us a sharper lens. John says the soul in purgation feels swallowed, shut up, consumed as if it were dying in darkness. That is the atmosphere of Lamentations 3, almost line for line, if you would. The speaker feels walled in, chained down, pierced, desolate. Why such violent images? Because purgation is not cosmetic. God is not adjusting Judah's behavior around the edges. He's dismantling the old confidence of the nation. The things Judah trusted in, city, king, temple, alliances, ordinary stability, are removed so that the people stand empty before God. And that brings us to the believer today. What happened corporately in Judah in Lamentations chapter 3, John says happens inwardly to the believer in the dark night. God begins to remove supports. Prayer may feel dry, familiarity, comforts fail. The poor believer feels poor, exposed, and unable to manage spiritual life by previous habits. And it does feel like reduction. But John's terms, God is not destroying the soul for destruction's sake. He is burning away rust. He is undoing attachments so that the soul can belong more purely to him. And that is why Lamentations chapter 3 turns towards hope, not because the suffering suddenly disappears, but because the speaker begins to reinterpret it. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. They are new every morning. That is the turning point. The one who wounds is also the one who restores. The one who casts down is not afflicting the heart forever. So, in the light of chapters 5 and 6 and Lamentations chapter 3, we see this record of terrible mercy. Judah is purged through a real historical judgment. The believer is purged through inward darkness. And in both cases, God wounds what is false in order to heal what is real. The darkness is dreadful, but it is not empty. It is the place where God strips away illusions so that repentance, humility, and hope can finally live. So, what can we do with this then? How do we apply this to our lives? Well, the first is hard. First, consent to the night instead of fighting it. Lamentation says it is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. St. John says we often suffer more when we cling to control and demand clarity. Consent is not quitting, it is opening your hands. Lord, if you are at work here, I will stay until you lead me out. Second, let the stripping reveal what you truly trust. When peace and comfort disappear, what do you grab for? Approval, success, a spiritual reputation, a certain kind of prayer experience? The night turns those small fires to ash. Let it show you the truth. Then say, even if your voice is shaking, the Lord is my portion. And 3, practice hope as a daily choice. Hope in the darkness is not a feeling, it is a decision. The prophet does not feel hope, he calls it to mind. Choose one small act every day, a verse, a simple prayer, a breath that says you are faithful. Even if it feels like you are just breathing in pounds and pounds of dust. Now, these steps are slow. They do not make the night shorter. They make the night fruitful, though. So you need to walk gently, walk honestly. Let your breath be your prayer. Trust that even in this darkness, you are held by God, whose love is stronger than this night. And that's where we'll end it for today. Thanks for listening and spending time with me on the Distracted Christian podcast, production of Fresh Ground Theology. I know you could have filled this hour with just about anything. So the fact that you chose to sit with me here in St. John of the Cross and this strange, beautiful idea of God loving you through dryness, it really matters. And I appreciate you being here. Huge thanks to Anton Koryakov for the theme music. He is the one making me sound way more calmer and wiser than I actually am. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts, make sure you follow and subscribe so you do not miss the next episode. And if this has helped you even a little bit, we'd love you to leave a rating and share it with somebody who's wondering why God feels quiet right now. For show notes, more reflections, and other theological rabbit holes in our flagship podcast, go to freshgroundtheology.com. That's where we park the extras. I'm Nate Labadorf. Thanks for listening. Stay faithful in the quiet, and I'll see you next time. Special thanks to Anton Koryakov for today's theme music on the show. Tune in to hear more next time. Thanks for listening.